By the late 1920s, the men who had rebuilt Europe after the First World War believed they had done something almost miraculous. Germany had been beaten, disarmed, readmitted, refinanced, and on the surface, civilized back into the concert of powers. Gustav Stresemann could travel to Paris as a statesman instead of a pariah. The Ruhr had been evacuated. The Reichsmark had replaced the paper delirium of hyperinflation. Foreign money flowed into German industry. Production boomed. Wages rose. In 1927, unemployment in Germany fell to 1 million. In Geneva, the League of Nations looked like the administrative brain of a new international order. In London, Paris, and New York, bankers and ministers convinced themselves that peace could be engineered if the numbers were calibrated correctly. One schedule for reparations, another for war debts, a central bank here, a stabilization loan there, a treaty to promise borders, a conference to smooth over the rest. It was a world of tables, annuities, commissions, and signatures, a world managed by experts. That was the peak, that was the confidence, and that, in hindsight, was the delusion. Because hidden inside this apparently rational settlement was a contradiction so large that it would eventually swallow continents. The victors wanted Germany punished but solvent. They wanted America repaid but disengaged. They wanted currencies fixed, budgets balanced, electorates calm, empires intact, and no one to use force. They wanted a peace that behaved like a spreadsheet. For a few brief years, it almost seemed to work. Then the loans slowed. Then the banks trembled. Then the unemployed filled the streets. Then the same statesmen who had promised that law and finance would prevent another catastrophe discovered that law without power is paper, and finance without politics is a fuse. If there is one object that captures the real origin of the Second World War, it is not a tank rolling into Poland and not a beer hall filled with fanatics. It is a short American proposal issued in June 1931 by President Herbert Hoover, asking the world to suspend for 1 year all intergovernmental debt and reparation payments. 1 year, that was all. On paper, it looked modest, almost boring, a temporary pause in accounting. But that single act was really an admission. It said that the post-1918 order could no longer survive its own financial logic. It said the victors could not collect what they had demanded, the debtors could not pay what they had signed, and the Peace of Versailles had become dependent on fresh borrowing from the very country that wanted to stay above the quarrel. By the time Hoover asked for that pause, what was collapsing was not merely credit, it was legitimacy. The question this story asks is simple, and it is far more unsettling than the popular version of 1939. If the peace settlement had to be frozen just to keep the system breathing, then when did the Second World War really begin? Start with the machinery. After the First World War, the Allied powers demanded compensation from Germany for the devastation of the conflict. In the spring of 1921, the Reparations Commission fixed the bill at 132 billion gold marks, roughly $31.5 billion at the time. That figure sits at the center of almost every simplified origin story, usually as proof that Versailles was so vindictive that another war became inevitable. But that is only the first layer. The second layer was even more dangerous. During the war, the United States had loaned the Allies more than $10 billion, and Washington was determined to be repaid. Britain then made the logic explicit in the Balfour Note. London would seek from Europe the same kind of payments it owed to America. In other words, German reparations were tied, politically if not always legally, to Allied war debts, which meant the entire peace depended on money moving in a circle. Germany would pay France and Britain would pay the United States. The United States, meanwhile, insisted on repayment but resisted being permanently entangled in European politics. It was an astonishing design. A defeated Germany financed a victorious coalition so that the coalition could service debts to a power that had rejected Versailles. No one should have expected this to be stable, and yet many did. When Germany defaulted in January 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr. Berlin answered with passive resistance. Inflation, already accelerating, turned into hyperinflation. The old mark died in public. Savings were annihilated. The financial fight over reparations had reached a point where the system either had to be reworked or break. So in 1924 came the Dawes Plan, the first great rescue. Germany's annual payments began at 1 billion gold marks and were to rise to 2.5 billion by 1928. The total bill was left unresolved, which was itself a kind of confession. Foreign supervision was imposed. A new currency was created. J.P. Morgan floated a $200 million loan to Germany. Over the next 4 years, American banks lent Germany enough for Germany to pay the Allies, and the Allies used those payments to service debts to the United States. It looked like recovery. In reality, it was refinancing disguised as peace. By 1929, the Young Plan tried again, reducing total reparations to 121 billion gold marks, payable over 58 years, ending some foreign controls, and creating the Bank for International Settlements to help handle transfers. In isolation, each adjustment appeared sensible. Together, they revealed a deeper truth: the settlement could survive only through constant technical revision. That is not what durable orders look like. Durable orders do not need emergency committees every few years. Durable orders do not require foreign credit to keep the loser solvent enough to compensate the winners. Durable orders do not depend on American liquidity while pretending not to depend on American power. Then came the global contraction, and the arithmetic turned savage. The United States crashed in 1929, but the crash did not stay American. As the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes, American demands for repayment hit an already fragile Germany with particular force, and the Weimar government chose to cut spending rather than stimulate, worsening the collapse. Ben Bernanke later summarized the international mechanism with brutal clarity. Under the gold standard, fixed exchange rates forced countries toward similar monetary policies, and when the Federal Reserve raised rates in 1928, other countries were pushed toward tightening as well. Gold outflows meant shrinking money supplies. Speculative attacks meant higher interest rates at the worst possible moment. The longer a country stayed on gold, the deeper its depression tended to be and the later its recovery. That mattered because Germany was not just any economy. It was a debtor economy, a treaty economy, and a politically brittle democracy whose apparent stabilization had rested heavily on short-term foreign lending. Once those loans dried up, the whole arrangement began to invert. The prosperity of 1925 to 1928 had been real enough, but it was vulnerable, and vulnerability in politics is rarely acknowledged until it becomes humiliation. By September 1931, unemployment in Germany had reached 4.3 million. In the early months of 1932, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed. Banks collapsed. Parliamentary government seized up. President Hindenburg and Chancellor Heinrich Brüning governed increasingly through emergency decree. The Social Democrats tolerated policies they disliked because they feared something worse. They were right to fear it, but wrong to believe austerity would hold the center. A recent NBER study by Gregory Gallifrey-Villa and his co-authors, using data from thousands of districts and cities, found that areas hit harder by spending cuts and tax increases saw higher Nazi vote shares and higher suffering measured by mortality. That does not mean austerity mechanically created Nazism. History is not a vending machine, but it does mean that the attempt to prove fiscal respectability inside a collapsing economy carried political consequences large enough to reshape the state. And this is where the popular memory often narrows too quickly around Hitler's charisma or Versailles as insult. The real crisis was more humiliating than insult. It was dependence. Germany had become the most important unstable hinge in an international financial structure that could not absorb failure, and once the hinge began to crack, everyone in the system started protecting ledgers before they protected legitimacy. Hoover's moratorium in 1931 was supposed to buy time. The Lausanne Conference in 1932 effectively admitted the old reparations scheme was finished. By mid-1933, most European debtors had defaulted on what they owed the United States. The peace had not just failed morally, it had failed in the numbers. The human face of this machine was Hjalmar Schacht, and he matters because he embodied the interwar faith that technical brilliance could rescue political catastrophe. Born in 1877, trained in banking, seasoned in war finance, Schacht rose through the German financial world before becoming the man credited with halting the ruinous inflation of 1922 and 1923. As Special Currency Commissioner and then President of the Reichsbank, he helped drive the stabilization that made Weimar's middle years possible. To contemporaries, he did not look like a prophet of barbarism. He looked like competence. He looked like the sort of man modern states rely on when slogans have burned through reality. He He understood central banking, balance sheets, confidence, foreign markets. He was precisely the kind of figure a shattered republic wanted to believe in, but that is what makes his story so valuable. Schacht's career shows how often the road to disaster is paved not only by fanatics but by problem solvers who mistake stabilization for settlement. He took part in the great work of restoring the mark, then led the German delegation in the 1929 reparations negotiations, then rejected the Young Plan, then resigned from the Reichsbank in 1930, moved closer to the nationalist right, and after Hitler took power, returned as Reichsbank president and later economics minister. The same man who had once saved the Republic from monetary ruin would help finance the regime that destroyed the Republic altogether. He eventually broke with aspects of Hitler's rearmament spending, but by then the essential service had been rendered. The technician had crossed over. That crossing is one of the central tragedies of the age. When liberal orders rely on experts to repair the consequences of unresolved political contradictions, they sometimes discover too late that expertise itself is portable. It can stabilize democracies, it can also weaponize dictatorships. Inside Berlin, the decisive turn did not look theatrical, it looked administrative. In 1930, Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning chancellor, and Brüning became the first of the presidential chancellors, ruling without a stable parliamentary majority. The crisis he faced was real. Tax revenue was collapsing, credit was tight, foreign confidence was weak, reparations still hung over the state. The logic of his response was cold, almost elegant in its severity. Cut spending, reduce wages and prices, restore confidence, prove that Germany was disciplined enough to survive and perhaps disciplined enough to win relief. In July 1930, when Parliament opposed a deflationary budget, Hindenburg and Brüning used Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution to impose it by emergency decree. There, in that choice, one can hear the real sound of a democracy being hollowed out. No drums, no marching boots, just the legal bypassing of representatives because the bond market, the creditor governments, the treaty framework, and the cabinet all demanded obedience faster than consent could provide it. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that Brüning oversaw the first in a series of presidential cabinets and used emergency powers to enact deflationary policy despite parliamentary opposition. Britannica adds that these measures failed to stop the downward spiral. This was not yet dictatorship, but it was the education of dictatorship. It taught millions of Germans that elected politics delivered pain while unelected authority delivered decisions. It taught conservatives that constitutional shortcuts were manageable. It taught radicals that the center had lost confidence in its own methods. And it taught Hitler something crucial. The Republic could be entered legally because it was already being partially suspended legally. When later generations say that the Nazis took power through elections, that is only half the sentence. They took power through elections inside a constitutional order already bent by financial emergency into rule by decree. Now widen the lens, because while Europe obsessed over debts and decrees, another story was unfolding in East Asia that at first seemed separate. In September 1931, near Mukden in Manchuria, an explosion on a railway line gave Japan's army the pretext it wanted. Within months, Japanese forces had overrun the region and consolidated control over a resource-rich territory under the facade of the state of Manchukuo. Here is the point that matters for our story. The international response was weak not simply because the aggressor was bold, but because the guardians of order were exhausted, divided, and economically terrified. According to the U.S. Office of the Historian, there was little support in the depression-hit early 1930s for meaningful economic sanctions against Japan. The United States sat in on League meetings. Appeals were made. The Stimson Doctrine announced non-recognition of conquests achieved in violation of treaty obligations. The Lytton Report condemned the new status quo. Japan walked out of the League in 1933 and kept Manchuria. That episode is often taught as an isolated failure of collective security. It was more than that. It was a demonstration effect. It showed that the post-war order could draft reports, issue doctrines, and preserve procedural dignity, but when confronted with a determined power, it preferred moral language to material risk. Patricia Clavin's work on the League of Nations, economic and financial organization, is illuminating here because she argues that the line between technical and political questions was never clean. The League's economic apparatus was trying to shape the world economy through expertise, publications, and cooperation. But the same international system that could discuss monetary stabilization with seriousness could not bring itself to bear the costs of enforcement. So revisionist states learned something chillingly practical. They learned that the men who preached discipline to debtors were hesitant to discipline aggressors. They learned that treaties were precise on paper and blurry in action. They learned that the world order was still speaking in the language of 1919 while living in the conditions of 1931. This is the contradiction at the center of the whole period, and once seen, it changes everything. The victors of 1918 claimed to be building a liberal order based on law, repayment, cooperation, and collective security. But the order they actually built made harsh demands where enforcement was easy and soft excuses where enforcement was dangerous. Germany's budgets could be supervised. Germany's payments could be renegotiated, recalculated, moralized over, and when needed, extracted through occupation. But in Manchuria and later in Ethiopia, the will to impose serious costs on armed revisionism evaporated. By 1935, the Abyssinian crisis made the lesson impossible to miss. The League applied sanctions against Italy, but not the sort that would truly break Mussolini's campaign, and the Horlaval episode exposed an even uglier truth. Leading British and French statesmen became associated with a secret plan to offer Mussolini most of Ethiopia in exchange for a truce. That was not mere hypocrisy, it was pedagogy. It taught every ambitious aggressor that the guardians of peace were strongest against signatures and weakest against force. It taught Germany that treaties could be rewritten if one moved quickly enough and made the alternatives seem worse. It taught Japan that condemnation without compulsion was survivable. It taught smaller states that promises of security were conditional on the convenience of creditors and empires. This is why the financial history matters so much. It is not because ledgers cause wars all by themselves. It is because financial systems rank priorities. They reveal what governments will sacrifice first. In the interwar years, governments repeatedly sacrificed democratic legitimacy, social stability, and eventually international credibility in order to postpone hard admissions about debt, power, and decline. As Adam Tooze later argued, Hitler's aggression can be understood not simply as revenge for Versailles, but as a reaction to a world-historic shift in power, the rise of Anglo-American dominance after the First World War. That is the larger frame. Hitler did not just hate the settlement. He recognized correctly that the settlement rested on an imbalance of material power Germany could not match within its constraints. His answer was not reform. It was a violent bid to escape the constraints altogether. The political bill came due with terrifying speed. In the March 1932 presidential election, Hindenburg received 18,661,736 votes to Hitler's 11,328,571, forcing a runoff. In April, Hindenburg won again, but Hitler rose to 13,417,460 votes. At the Prussian state elections later that month, the Nazis won 162 of 428 seats. In the Reichstag election of July 31, 1932, they captured 230 seats and became the dominant party. These figures matter because they show the speed with which economic collapse became constitutional collapse. They also show why purely moral interpretations of the Nazi rise can be insufficient. Moral disgust is necessary. But moral disgust alone does not explain why so many elites decided Hitler was usable or why so many voters decided he was preferable. The system had exhausted trust. Bruning's deflation had failed. Papen and Schleicher would fail differently. Parliamentary normality had already been degraded. When Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 1933, the regime inherited not a healthy state hijacked by a madman but a battered state whose political antibodies had been weakened by years of financial shock and emergency rule. Then the process reversed. Schacht returned. Rearmament and public works helped slash unemployment. Recovery of a sort arrived under dictatorship. That fact mattered enormously because it allowed the regime to present coercion as competence. Tooze describes the Nazi buildup as the greatest and most rapid mobilization of resources in peacetime the capitalist world had ever seen. That mobilization did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a country that had learned through the 1920s and early 1930s that foreign dependence was dangerous, Parliamentary bargaining was humiliating, and economic weakness invited subordination. None of that made Nazi choices inevitable, but it made them intelligible to far too many people, and the costs were not merely German. Once Berlin left the path of revision through conferences and entered the path of revision through rearmament, the entire unresolved crisis of the interwar order changed form. What had been argued in annuities and moratoria would now be argued in divisions, bomb tonnage, and occupied territories. What had been deferred in 1931 would be paid in blood through the 1940s and far beyond, in a war that destroyed European primacy, shattered cities, consumed empires, and left the global balance of power in utterly different hands. But this is the point where a serious history has to slow down and refuse the temptations of tabloid certainty. It would be easy to say that reparations caused Hitler, that Wall Street caused the war, that bankers wrote the script and dictators merely acted it out. That is too neat. It is also wrong. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is explicit that the Great Depression and Germany's economic conditions were not solely responsible for Hitler's rise. Many societies suffered depression without producing Nazism. Antisemitism was not invented by a balance sheet. Japanese militarism had its own roots. Italian imperial ambition did not require the Dawes Plan. And even within Germany, voters and elites made choices that were contingent, moral, and avoidable. Zara Steiner warned against treating the 1920s merely as a pre-war prologue. It was a post-war decade with its own possibilities, some of them genuine. That matters because if we tell the story as pure inevitability, we flatter ourselves. We imply that everyone was trapped by structure, that no one could have acted differently, that no courage was possible. In fact, what the financial history shows is something harder and more human. It shows decision-makers repeatedly choosing the narrower horizon. They chose creditor logic over political repair. They chose emergency decrees over persuasive majorities. They chose symbolic sanctions over credible enforcement. They chose temporary fixes over honest settlement. The system did not collapse because one number on one treaty was too high. It collapsed because a whole class of leaders believed incompatible promises could be managed indefinitely if entrusted to experts, committees, and deferments. That is a much less comforting story because it does not blame one villain alone. It blames habits of governance. So the true origin of the Second World War was not a single meeting, not a single treaty clause, not a single demagogue screaming into a microphone. It was the fatal belief that a broken political order could be stabilized financially without being transformed politically. That was the violated expectation. The men of the 1920s believed they could punish Germany, repay America, restore gold, restrain revisionism, preserve democracy, and avoid hard choices about power, all at the same time. They could not. When the pressure came, every elegant abstraction was tested against fear, unemployment, and force, and elegant abstractions lose those contests. Always. That is why this story still matters. Because the most dangerous crises are often the ones that look, at first, purely technical. A payment schedule, a reserve ratio, a temporary moratorium, a decree issued for efficiency, a sanction designed not to bite too hard. A compromise no one will notice. Then one day the paperwork is gone and the consequences are marching. If this argument lands with you, write the word ledger in the comments because that is what this history really was before it became a battlefield. A ledger nobody wanted to close honestly. And if you want more financial history told without romance and without amnesia, stay with this channel. Because the moments that change the world are very often filed away first as accounting problems.